February of 1994, on this very stage in Sanders Theatre, 6 rediscovered Haydn keyboard sonatas were going to be performed in front of a live audience for the first time in over 200 years. But the music you've just been listening to has never been heard in this space before. Harvard canceled the recital because, 1 month before the event, evidence was discovered that the sonatas had been composed not by Haydn in the 1760s, but rather by a 45-year-old music teacher living in Germany. This story is an example of what I call musical forgery. For the purposes of my work, I define musical forgery as the act of attributing your own compositions to somebody else without their knowledge or consent. I came to this topic because, as a musicologist, I'm interested in how and why we value music the way we do, not only in terms of aesthetics and economics, but also in terms of ethics. With this in mind, I want to focus on what I think is one of the most profound questions that forgeries can ask of us. Why is an authentic composition more valuable than a forgery anyway? Now, if you were talking about the value of forgeries in the visual arts, then the answer would almost certainly involve huge sums of money. Paintings, for example, are unique and highly desirable objects for collectors. So, of course, authenticity will determine financial value. But music is different. Unlike paintings, musical compositions do not necessarily correspond to single physical objects created by the author. The scores of the forged Haydn sonatas, for example, were never supposed to have been written down by Haydn himself. The story was that they had been transcribed decades after his death and hundreds of miles from where he lived. I found this to be a common characteristic of musical forgeries. They tend to masquerade as copies of copies of copies. And while this makes them difficult to repudiate, it also means that nobody is making millions of dollars here. So what about aesthetic value? Did the sonatas imitate Haydn's style well enough to pass for the real thing? Consider this passage from the D minor sonata. The chord that I've highlighted is what music theorists call a tritone substituted dominant. Now that sounds really technical, but all you need to know about tritone substitutions is that they are really common in 20th century jazz and rock music, but in the 18th century they were so rare as to be almost non-existent. To show you what I mean, I've recomposed the passage so that it follows the conventional musical grammar, so to speak, of the 18th century. Here's what that sounds like. By contrast, here's what the forgery actually sounds like, this time with the tritone substitution. Now, as an expert, I'm supposed to tell you that that harmonic crunch you just heard in the second version is anachronistic. But if you liked it better than my grammatically correct recomposition, then you're in good company. For many of the musicologists who initially championed the sonatas, the works rang true precisely because of this kind of precocious originality. We do not expect geniuses to do things by the book. So if musical forgeries are not worth a lot of money, and they're often composed well enough to satisfy even the experts, then what's the harm? After all, music is often thought to be about the sensuous pleasure of listening above all else. Sounding good is what counts. But this school of thought has some alarming implications. Think of the last time you had a strong, personal, emotional reaction to a work of art. How would you feel if you discovered that the author of that artwork was not the person who who you had imagined. For many of us, the visceral experience of being moved is underpinned by a sense of trust. Whether we encounter art in a museum, a concert hall, or here in Sanders Theatre, we trust the institutions that place works before us to frame them in historical reality. Beauty, after all, is a powerful thing. When we are truly moved, we want assurance that we have been moved truly. Today, after 23 years, the Forged Haydn sonatas have found a place on this stage. The paradox is that we can still find them beautiful, even as they remind us that music's true value is more than sounding good. Thank you.